during their first winter together. On it, she had woven the finest cloth in 3 villages, tapestries that told stories of heroic deeds, warm wool that kept families through harsh winters, and delicate ceremonial garments that marked life's most precious moments. The loom had been her identity, her livelihood, and her anchor to a world that now felt impossibly distant. She had sold it 3 days ago to a young woman whose eyes sparkled with the same passion Ingrid once felt. The transaction had broken something inside her chest, but it had also provided the silver she needed for this final journey. The loom would continue creating beauty in younger hands, while Ingrid sought something she couldn't quite name. Perhaps peace, perhaps purpose, or perhaps simply a place to rest her weary soul. The bear shifted slightly, a small movement that sent Ingrid's heart racing. Yet he made no move toward her, showed no aggression. Instead, those intelligent eyes seemed to study her with the same careful assessment she was giving him. There was something almost human in his gaze, a depth of understanding that wild animals simply didn't possess. Bjorn would have charged forward with his battle-axe raised, roaring a challenge that would have echoed off these stone walls. Her beloved husband had never met a problem he couldn't solve with strength and courage. He had been the fiercest warrior in their village, standing a head taller than most men, with arms like tree trunks and a laugh that could fill any room. When raiders had threatened their settlement 5 winters ago, Bjorn had led the defense with the tactical brilliance that made him legendary among their people. But Bjorn was gone now, fallen in a skirmish with Danish raiders while protecting a trading caravan. His body had been burned on a pyre befitting a hero, surrounded by weapons and treasures that would serve him in the afterlife. Ingrid had stood beside that fire, watching the flames consume the man who had been her anchor for 37 years, and felt something inside herself burn away as well. Their 3 children had grieved in their own ways. Magnus, their eldest, had taken his father's place leading the village guard, his jaw set with the same stubborn determination that had defined Bjorn. Astrid, their only daughter, had married a good man from a neighboring settlement and now tended 3 children of her own. And young Eric, no longer young at 28, had always been the dreamer of the family. 2 months after his father's funeral, he had announced his intention to sail west with a group of explorers seeking new lands beyond the great ocean. One by one, they had built their own lives as children should. Ingrid had raised them to be independent, to follow their own paths with courage and wisdom. She felt proud of their strength, even as their absence left her feeling like a ship cut loose from its moorings. The house that had once echoed with laughter and arguments, with the sounds of family life in all its messy glory, had grown silent except for the whisper of wind through the rafters. The village had tried to care for her, as was proper for a warrior's widow. The other women had invited her to their gatherings. The younger men had offered to tend her garden and repair her roof. But Ingrid had felt like a ghost haunting her own life, going through the motions of living while her heart remained buried with Bjorn's ashes. The loom, which had once brought her such joy, became a reminder of all she had lost. Every thread she wove seemed to whisper of empty rooms and cold nights. The merchant who had sold her this haul had been reluctant to complete the transaction. He was a thin, nervous man, with darting eyes, who kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting trouble to follow him down the mountain path. The hall had been empty for 15 years, he told her, ever since the last owner had fled in the middle of a winter night. Local people whispered about strange sounds echoing from the valley, about lights moving through the windows when no human soul lived within these walls. But Ingrid had been beyond caring about village superstitions. She needed solitude, a place where she could grieve properly without well-meaning neighbors offering comfort she wasn't ready to accept. The highlands had always called to her. The clean air, the endless sky, the sense of being closer to whatever realm housed the souls of the departed. If the hall came with a few ghostly tales, so much the better. Ghosts, at least, would understand the weight of carrying memories that belonged to another time. The building itself was magnificent despite its abandonment. Constructed from local stone and massive timber beams, it had been built to last centuries. The great hall stretched 40 feet from the entrance to the raised dais, where a lord would once have held court. Tall windows lined the walls, their shutters hanging askew, but their frames still solid. The roof showed signs of neglect, missing stones and gaps that would need attention before winter arrived in earnest, but the basic structure remained sound. Most impressive was the enormous hearth that dominated the far wall. Built from dressed stone and decorated with carved runes that spoke of prosperity and protection, it could easily accommodate logs the size of small trees. Above it, the blackened stones told of countless fires that had warmed this space through long northern winters. Ingrid could imagine the hall filled with people, voices raised in song and story, the warmth of community creating a bulwark against the cold world outside. Now, however, the hall's only occupant was this massive bear who watched her with such unsettling intelligence. His fur was the deep brown of fertile earth, thick and lustrous despite the circumstances of his residence. His size was truly remarkable. Standing on all fours, his shoulders reached nearly to Ingrid's chest, and she suspected he would tower over her if he rose on his hind legs. Yet for all his intimidating presence, he showed no signs of aggression. No bared teeth, no threatening postures, no territorial displays that she might expect from a wild animal defending its territory. Instead, he simply waited, as if he understood that this moment required careful consideration from both parties. His breathing was steady and calm, his massive head tilted slightly, as if listening not just to the sounds she made, but to thoughts she hadn't yet spoken. There was something deeply unsettling about that gaze, but also something oddly comforting. She had the strangest sense that he was no more surprised to see her than she should have been to find him. The bear's presence explained the merchant's nervousness, the tales of strange sounds and mysterious lights. Perhaps previous potential buyers had encountered this magnificent creature and fled in terror. Ingrid, however, found herself strangely calm as she studied her unexpected housemate. Perhaps it was because she had already lost everything that truly mattered to her. What was one more impossible situation to navigate? Slowly, carefully, she stepped fully into the hall and closed the heavy door behind her. The sound echoed through the vast space, but the bear didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed to relax slightly, as if her decision to enter rather than flee had settled some question that had been troubling him. Ingrid set her traveling pack on the floor near the entrance, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Well," she said softly, her voice rusty from the day's journey. "It seems we're to be neighbors." The bear's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, and she could have sworn she saw something shift in his expression. For just a moment, those dark eyes seemed to hold a very human sort of understanding, as if he grasped not just her words, but the meaning behind them. Then the moment passed, leaving Ingrid to wonder if grief and exhaustion were making her imagine things that couldn't possibly be real. As the afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting patterns of light and shadow across the stone floor, Ingrid began to take inventory of her new home. The hall was surprisingly clean for a building that had supposedly stood empty for 15 years. The floors were swept, the windows were free of the spider webs she had expected to find, and the air smelled of pine and wood smoke rather than the mustiness of abandonment. The bear followed her movements with those intelligent eyes, but made no attempt to approach or interfere. When she climbed the wooden stairs to explore the upper chambers, he remained in the great hall below. When she returned to examine the storage rooms and kitchens attached to the main building, he stayed near the hearth like a faithful hound. It was as if he understood the concept of giving her space to adjust to this strange new arrangement. In the gathering dusk, Ingrid made her first practical decision as the hall's new owner. She gathered wood from the neat pile stacked beside the hearth, wood that shouldn't have been there if the building was truly abandoned, and built a fire. The bear watched her work, but showed no alarm when the flames caught and began to fill the space with warmth and dancing light. As she sat cross-legged before the fire, unpacking the simple meal she had brought for her first night in her new home, Ingrid found herself speaking to her unlikely companion. "I don't know what you are or why you're here," she said, breaking hard cheese into small pieces, "but I suppose we'll have to figure out how to share this place. I've nowhere else to go, and you seem to have claimed it before I arrived." The bear's response was to settle himself more comfortably on the stone floor, his massive form creating a living barrier between Ingrid and the door. Whether this was protection or containment she couldn't say, but something about his presence felt oddly reassuring rather than threatening. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the crushing weight of being utterly alone. Outside, the wind picked up as evening settled over the highlands, whistling through the gaps in the shutters and reminding Ingrid that winter was approaching faster than she had hoped. Inside, however, the great hall felt warm and almost welcoming, the firelight playing across stone walls that had witnessed centuries of human joy and sorrow. And across from her, a mysterious bear kept silent vigil, his presence a puzzle she was strangely eager to solve. The discovery came on her third morning in the hall, when restlessness drove Ingrid to explore corners she had only glimpsed in her initial survey. The bear had maintained his respectful distance, following a routine that seemed almost human in its deliberateness. Mornings spent near the hearth, afternoons positioned by the great windows where he could watch the mountain paths. Evenings settled near the door as if standing guard. He took food she left for him, bread, dried meat, the roots she had packed for her journey, but only after she had withdrawn to give him privacy. Behind a wooden chest, in what had once been a sleeping chamber, her fingers discovered something that made her heart race. A stone tablet, roughly the size of her palm, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light filtering through the shutters. The runes were unlike any she had seen before, yet something about them felt familiar, as if they spoke to a part of her memory that predated conscious thought. As she carried the ancient runestone into the great hall, the bear's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. He rose to his full, imposing height, easily 8 feet when standing upright, and approached her with movements that held none of the lumbering gait she expected from such a massive creature. Instead, his steps were measured, almost ceremonial, as if he recognized the significance of what she had found. "You know what this is," she said, not really asking a question. The bear's dark eyes fixed on the stone in her hands, and she could swear she saw longing there, mixed with something that looked remarkably like pain. "This is connected to you somehow." The bear lowered himself back to all fours, but remained close, his massive head tilted upward to study both Ingrid and the runestone. When she held it toward him, he didn't retreat. Instead, he exhaled a long, slow breath that sounded almost like a sigh, a sound no wild animal should make, filled as it was with distinctly human emotion. Ingrid settled cross-legged on the floor, the runestone cradled in her lap. The bear positioned himself directly across from her, creating an intimate circle, despite the vast space around them. For long moments, they simply regarded each other in the morning light, woman and beast connected by some understanding that transcended the normal boundaries between species. "I think," Ingrid said slowly, running her thumb across the carved symbols, "that you understand every word I'm saying." The bear's response was subtle but unmistakable. A slight dip of his great head, an expression in his eyes that seemed to say, "Yes, finally, someone sees." Ingrid felt her breath catch in her throat. In her 63 years, she had heard tales of magic and transformation, stories told around winter fires when the wind howled beyond the walls. But encountering such things in her own life was something entirely different. "Are you—" she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what seemed impossible. "Will you want something else?" This time the bear's reaction was stronger. He lowered his head until his muzzle nearly touched the stone floor, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of profound grief. When he raised his eyes to meet hers again, Ingrid saw such human anguish there that her own heart clenched in sympathy. She had seen that same look in her own mirror during the long months after Bjorn's death. the expression of someone who had lost not just what they loved, but who they were. The bear wasn't just intelligent. He was suffering in a way that spoke to the deepest parts of her own experience with loss. "Oh," she whispered, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "Oh, you poor soul." Without thinking, she reached out toward him. The bear didn't flinch or retreat. Instead, he moved closer, allowing her weathered hand to rest against the thick fur of his massive head. His breathing was steady beneath her palm, and she could feel the warmth of life pulsing just beneath the surface. Whatever force had transformed him, it hadn't diminished the essential spark that made him who he was. "I know what it's like," she said softly, "to wake up and find yourself trapped in a life you don't recognize. To look in the mirror and see a stranger wearing your face." The bear's eyes closed at her words, and she felt a subtle tremor run through his massive frame. It was then that she began to speak of things she hadn't shared with anyone since Bjorn's death. The terrible emptiness that had consumed her. The nights when she had lain awake, wondering if she would ever feel like herself again. The gradual realization that the woman she had been was gone forever, and something new would have to take her place. "They all wanted me to get better," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "To go back to being the woman I was before. But that woman died with my husband. I've been trying to figure out who I am now. What's left when everything that defined you is stripped away?" The bear opened his eyes and looked at her with such understanding that Ingrid felt tears gathering for the first time since the funeral. Here in this impossible moment, she had found someone who truly comprehended the weight of being lost in your own life. The fact that he wore a different skin, that he couldn't speak the words that might offer comfort, somehow made it easier to share the truth she had been carrying alone. "The worst part," she admitted, "is the guilt. Bjorn would want me to be happy. He'd be furious if he knew I was wasting away missing him. But I don't know how to be happy without him. I don't even know how to be me without him." The bear shifted position, moving until he was lying on the stone floor with his great head resting near her feet. It was a gesture of such trust and companionship that Ingrid felt something inside her chest, some knot of tension she had carried for months, begin to loosen. For the first time since her husband's death, she didn't feel entirely alone with her grief. As the morning progressed into afternoon, Ingrid found herself sharing stories she hadn't told anyone. She spoke of the early days of her marriage, when she and Bjorn had been young and foolish and so deeply in love that they could barely stand to be apart for a day. She told the bear about their children's births, about the pride that had filled Bjorn's face when he first held each tiny life they had created together. She described the rhythm of their years together, the seasonal cycles of planting and harvest, the quiet evenings by their own hearth, the way Bjorn's hands had felt when he helped her work at the loom. The bear listened to every word with an attention that was both flattering and slightly unnerving. He never seemed restless or bored, never gave any indication that he wished to be elsewhere. Instead, he appeared to hang on every detail, as if her memories of love and partnership were treasures he had been seeking for longer than she could imagine. When she spoke of Bjorn's final battle, of the messenger who had brought news of his heroic death, the bear's expression grew particularly intent. There was something in his eyes that suggested he understood not just the pain of loss, but the specific anguish of being left behind while someone you loved fell to violence and betrayal. "He died protecting others," Ingrid said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "That's who he was, a man who couldn't stand by when people needed help, even if it meant leaving me alone." The bear made a sound then, low and rumbling, that seemed to carry its own weight of grief. Looking into his eyes, Ingrid had the strongest impression that he, too, had loved someone who died because they chose duty over safety. The thought that this magnificent creature might understand her loss from both sides, as someone left behind and as someone who had made impossible choices, created a bond between them that felt as strong as any she had known. As evening approached and the light began to fade from the tall windows, Ingrid realized she had talked more in one day than she had in the entire month before leaving her village. The bear had given her something she hadn't known she needed, not advice or empty comfort, but simply the presence of another soul who understood the landscape of profound loss. When she finally rose to prepare for the night, the bear followed her movements with those intelligent eyes. As she banked the fire and arranged her bedroll near the hearth, he took up his customary position between her and the door. But tonight, his vigil felt less like the watch of a guard and more like the companionship of a friend who had promised to see her safely through the darkness. "Thank you," she whispered into the quiet hall, "for listening, for understanding." The bear's response was a soft rumble that seemed to say what words could not, that understanding was a gift that flowed both ways, and that neither of them would have to carry their burdens alone anymore. By the end of her first week in the mountain hall, Ingrid had established routines that accommodated her unusual housemate with a practicality that would have made Bjorn proud. She woke at dawn to rebuild the fire, prepared her simple meals at the smaller hearth in the kitchen area, and spent her mornings exploring the hall and its surroundings, while the bear maintained his patient watch from various positions throughout the building. It was during one of these explorations that she made a decision that would change the careful balance they had established. In the chamber where she had found the rune stone, tucked beneath layers of dust and forgotten linens, she discovered a wooden chest containing items that spoke to a life interrupted rather than abandoned. Among these belongings was a weapon that made her breath catch, Bjorn's war axe, or one so similar it might have been crafted by the same hand. The axe was a masterwork of iron and oak, its double-headed blade etched with protective runes, its handle worn smooth by years of faithful service. It was the kind of weapon carried by a man who had earned his place among the greatest warriors of his generation. But more than its obvious quality, what struck Ingrid was how perfectly it fit her hands when she lifted it from the chest. Bjorn had insisted she learn to handle weapons during their early years together. A warrior's wife, he had said with characteristic bluntness, must be able to defend hearth and home when her husband is called to battle. She had protested initially, claiming that her loom and her healing skills were contribution enough to their household. But Bjorn had been persistent, and eventually she had discovered an unexpected aptitude for the weight and balance of well-crafted steel. Now, standing in the dusty chamber with the axe balanced in her grip, Ingrid felt something she hadn't experienced since her husband's death, a sense of her own capability. The woman who had once been known as much for her fierce determination as for her weaving skills still existed beneath the grief and uncertainty. Perhaps it was time to remind both herself and her mysterious companion that she was not entirely helpless. She carried the axe into the great hall where the bear was positioned near the tall windows, watching the afternoon light play across the mountain slopes. When he turned to observe her approach, his reaction to the weapon was immediate and profound. He rose to his full height, but rather than showing aggression or alarm, his posture suggested something closer to respect. "I want you to understand something," Ingrid said, setting her feet in the balanced stance Bjorn had taught her decades ago. "I'm not here because I have nowhere else to go. I chose this place, and I'm choosing to stay despite, or perhaps because of your presence. But I won't be a victim or a burden." She raised the axe, not in threat but in demonstration, letting its weight settle naturally in her hands. The movements came back to her as if she had practiced them yesterday rather than years ago. The controlled arc of the blade, the precise balance point that allowed for both power and accuracy, the fluid transition from defensive guard to striking position. The bear watched every movement with intense concentration, his intelligent eyes tracking the weapon's path through the air. When she completed the sequence and lowered the axe to rest against her shoulder, he approached her with movements that seemed almost ceremonial. There was no fear in his advance, no challenge or aggression. Instead, he stopped just beyond arm's reach and lowered his massive head in what could only be described as acknowledgement. "Good," Ingrid said, feeling oddly breathless from the brief exercise. "I think we understand each other better now." That understanding deepened over the following days as they navigated the practical challenges of sharing space. The bear, she discovered, was remarkably considerate for a creature who could have simply claimed the entire hall by right of size and natural weaponry. When she needed to work in the kitchen area, he withdrew to give her room. When she wished to read by the fire in the evenings, she had brought several precious books in her traveling pack. He positioned himself where his presence was comforting but not intrusive. More remarkably, he began to demonstrate protective instincts that went far beyond territorial behavior. On her 8th night in the hall, Ingrid was awakened by a sound that made her blood run cold, the howling of wolves echoing across the mountain valley. She had heard such sounds before, usually from the safety of a well-fortified village with armed men standing guard. Here, alone, except for her unusual companion, the wolf song seemed far more threatening. The bear's response was immediate and decisive. He rose from his position near the hearth and moved to the great door, his entire body radiating alertness. When the howling grew closer, accompanied by the scrape of claws on stone outside the building, he positioned himself directly in front of the entrance and released a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. The sound was unlike anything Ingrid had ever heard, not just the voice of a powerful predator, but something that carried authority and ancient warning. It spoke of strength that could crush bones and will that would not yield. More importantly, it spoke of protection, freely given and fiercely maintained. The wolves fell silent. After several long minutes, Ingrid heard the sound of paws retreating down the mountain path, their owners apparently deciding that whatever sheltered within the hall was not worth challenging. The bear maintained his guard position until the last echo of their departure faded into the night wind. "Thank you," Ingrid whispered from her bedroll near the fire. The bear turned his great head toward her, and in the firelight she could see something that looked remarkably like a smile in his expression. He had protected her not because she was weak, but because she was under his care. The distinction mattered more than she could easily express. As autumn deepened toward winter, their partnership evolved in ways that surprised them both. Ingrid shared her meals with the bear, dividing her carefully hoarded supplies with the same matter-of-fact generosity she had once shown to unexpected guests in her village home. The bear, in turn, began bringing her gifts from his expeditions into the surrounding mountains, particularly choice firewood, medicinal herbs she recognized from her healing work, and occasionally small game that supplemented their diet. During the long evenings by the fire, Ingrid found herself talking to him about everything and nothing, memories of her children's childhood adventures, stories Bjorn had told of his own warrior days, observations about the changing weather, and the preparations necessary for surviving a mountain winter. The bear listened to every word with the same focused attention he had shown during their first difficult conversation, occasionally responding with soft rumbles that seemed to indicate understanding or agreement. It was during one of these fireside conversations that Ingrid first spoke directly about her husband's weapon and what it meant to her. "Bjorn carved protective runes into the blade himself," she said, running her fingers along the axe's smooth handle. "He said that as long as I carried it with courage, no harm would come to those I chose to defend." The bear's reaction to this statement was profound. He moved closer to the fire, positioning himself where he could study both Ingrid and the axe she held. In his eyes, she saw something that looked remarkably like hope, as if her willingness to take up arms, not just for herself, but for others, was exactly what he had been waiting to see. "I think," Ingrid said slowly, watching his expression in the flickering firelight, "that you've been alone for a very long time. And I think you're not sure whether to trust someone who claims they'll stay." The bear's response was to rest his massive head on his front paws and close his eyes, but not before she caught a glimpse of vulnerability that made her chest tighten with sympathy. Whatever had trapped him in this form, Whatever had brought him to this lonely hall, he had learned the hard way that people were more likely to flee than to fight for something worth preserving. "Well," she said, settling the axe across her knees, and gazing into the fire, "I suppose we'll both have to learn new ways of trusting." The carved wooden crown was no larger than Ingrid's palm, but its intricate workmanship spoke of royal hands and ancient ceremonies. She discovered it on a crisp morning when the bear had returned from one of his solitary expeditions into the mountains, a piece of bark clinging to his thick fur that caught her attention as he settled by the fire. When she approached to brush away what she assumed was debris from his travels, her fingers instead found the small crown nested deep in the fur behind his left ear. The bear went completely still at her touch, as if he had been caught carrying a secret too precious to share, but too meaningful to abandon. "What is this?" she whispered, carefully working the delicate carving free from where it had been hidden. The crown was warm from contact with his body, and the wood, some variety she didn't recognize, seemed to pulse with its own inner life. Tiny runes circled its circumference, and the whole piece had been crafted with a skill that suggested royal artisans working under the direction of someone who understood the deep symbology of leadership. The bear's reaction was unlike anything she had witnessed before. He lowered himself to the stone floor and rested his massive head on his front paws. But his eyes remained fixed on the crown in her hands, with an expression of such profound longing that Ingrid felt her heart constrict. This wasn't simple attachment to a pretty object. This was a soul, recognizing something fundamental to its identity. "This was yours," she said, not really asking. Before you became—" She struggled for words that could encompass the impossible situation they shared. "This belonged to the man you were." The bear's response was a sound she had never heard him make before, low and keening, filled with grief that seemed to echo from the deepest chambers of memory. It was the voice of someone mourning not just what they had lost, but who they had been. Ingrid sank to her knees beside him, the crown cradled in her palms like a living thing. "Will you tell me?" she asked softly. "Not in words, perhaps, but in whatever way you can. I need to understand what happened to you." What followed was unlike any communication Ingrid had ever experienced. The bear rose and moved through the hall with purposeful steps, leading her to specific locations and objects that seemed to tell pieces of a larger story. Near the great hearth, he pawed at stones that bore the scorch marks of old fires, then looked at her with eyes that spoke of feasts and celebrations, of a hall filled with warmth and loyal companions. At the raised dais, where a lord's chair would once have stood, he reared up on his hind legs and remained there for a long moment, his massive form filling the space with regal bearing despite his animal form. Then he lowered himself and touched his nose to the floor in a gesture of profound humility, as if acknowledging how far he had fallen from that position of honor. But it was when he led her to the tall windows overlooking the mountain path that Ingrid began to grasp the true tragedy of his situation. The bear positioned himself where he could see down the valley, then made a series of movements that seemed to reenact some terrible memory. He would look toward the path as if watching for approaching figures, then rear up as if in greeting, then suddenly rear back as if struck by some devastating blow. "Betrayal," Ingrid breathed, understanding flooding through her. "Someone you trusted. Someone you welcomed here." The bear's confirmation was a sound of such raw pain that Ingrid felt tears gathering in her own eyes. She had seen betrayal destroy strong men during her years as a warrior's wife, had watched friends turned into enemies by greed or politics or simple human weakness. But to be betrayed so completely that it stripped away not just position and power, but humanity itself, that was a cruelty that exceeded anything in her experience. "And the crown," she said, looking down at the carving in her hands, "this is all that's left of who you were." That evening, as snow began to fall outside the tall windows, the first real snow of the approaching winter, Ingrid shared her own stories of betrayal and abandonment. She told the bear about the neighbors who had promised to look after her following Bjorn's death, then gradually stopped visiting when her grief proved more complicated than they had expected to handle. She described the relatives who had suggested she might be better off moving to a larger settlement where she could start fresh, as if 37 years of marriage could be discarded. Like an outgrown garment, the worst part, she admitted, settling closer to the fire as the wind picked up outside, was realizing that they saw my grief as inconvenient, as if mourning my husband was a burden I was placing on them rather than work I needed to do for myself. The bear had positioned himself near enough that she could rest her hand against his flank, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing and the warmth radiating from his massive frame. When she spoke of loneliness and the weight of being misunderstood, she felt subtle tremors run through his body that suggested he knew exactly what she meant. "Is that why you stay here?" she asked. "Because this is the only place where you don't have to pretend to be something you're not." The bear's response was to shift position until his great head rested near her feet, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he gazed up at her. In that look, Ingrid saw not just agreement, but gratitude, as if her understanding of his situation was a gift he had been waiting years to receive. The storm that hit them 2 days later was fierce enough to test every aspect of their partnership. Snow, driven by howling winds, piled against the shutters and found every crack in the hall's defenses. The temperature dropped so dramatically that even the great hearth seemed inadequate to warm the vast space, and Ingrid found herself grateful beyond measure for the bear's presence. He seemed to understand instinctively how to help her weather the crisis. When she struggled to reach the woodpile through the driving snow, he cleared a path with his massive paws and helped her drag logs back to the hall. When the wind threatened to tear the shutters from their hinges, he braced his weight against them while she secured the latches from inside. When the cold became so intense that she couldn't stop shivering despite the fire, he positioned himself like a living wall between her and the drafts, his body heat creating a pocket of warmth that made the difference between survival and catastrophe. During the 3 days they were trapped together by the storm, their relationship deepened in ways that surprised them both. Ingrid found herself talking to the bear as if he were the closest friend she had ever known, sharing thoughts and fears she had never voiced to another living soul. The bear, in turn, began to show her glimpses of the man he had once been, moments of humor when he mimicked her expressions, displays of courtly manners when he offered her the choicest pieces of their shared meals, and a protective gentleness that spoke of someone who had once been responsible for the welfare of many. On the 3rd night, as the wind finally began to quiet and the snow stopped driving against the windows, Ingrid made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. She moved her bedroll closer to where the bear rested, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his massive frame, but not so close as to make him uncomfortable. "I think," she said into the firelit darkness, "that whoever you were before this happened, you were someone worth knowing, someone worth staying with, whatever the cost." The bear's response was a sound she was learning to recognize as contentment, a low rumble that seemed to come from the deepest part of his chest. But tonight there was something else in that sound, something that spoke of hope, carefully guarded but beginning to grow. As she drifted off to sleep to the sound of his steady breathing, Ingrid realized that for the first time since Bjorn's death, she felt truly at peace. Whatever strange fate had brought them together, she was beginning to understand that their meeting was not accident, but necessity. 2 wounded souls finding in each other the companionship that made healing possible. The ancient silver torque lay hidden beneath a loose stone in the floor, discovered only because the bear had led Ingrid to that exact spot, with an urgency that brooked no argument. His behavior that morning had been unlike anything she had witnessed. Before, restless pacing, pointed looks toward the eastern wall of the hall, and finally a deliberate pawing at the stones until she understood he wanted her to investigate. The talk was magnificent despite its age, crafted from silver so pure it seemed to glow with its own inner light. Intricate knotwork covered its surface, interwoven with runes that spoke of noble blood and royal authority. But more than its obvious value, what struck Ingrid was how perfectly it fit the bear's massive neck when she held it up to measure. This had been made for him, specifically for him, when he wore a different form. King Aldrich, she whispered, the name coming to her lips as if spoken by someone else. The bear's reaction was immediate and profound, a sharp intake of breath. That sounded almost human, followed by a trembling that ran through his entire massive frame. "That's who you are. That's who you were." The talk seemed to unlock something in the bear's memory, or perhaps gave Ingrid access to understanding she hadn't possessed before. As she held the silver circlet, images flooded her mind, not her own memories, but fragments of a life lived centuries before her birth. She saw a man in his prime, tall and broad-shouldered, with kind eyes and hands that had never known defeat in battle. She saw this hall filled with light and laughter, with loyal companions and a kingdom that prospered under wise leadership. But she also saw the darkness that had crept into that golden time. A trusted advisor with a silver tongue, an ambitious heart, whispering poison into willing ears. Talk of the king's growing weakness, his supposed unfitness to rule, his dangerous attachment to old ways in a changing world. Aldrich had been too trusting, too willing to believe the best of those closest to him, and that trust had become the weapon used to destroy him. The betrayal had come during what should have been a celebration, a feast to mark the harvest season, with the hall filled with friends and allies. The advisor had proposed a toast to the king's health, offering a cup of wine that had been blessed, he claimed, by the old priest to ensure long life and continued prosperity. Aldrich had drunk deeply, surrounded by those he loved and trusted, and felt the curse take hold, even as the false smiles turned to sneers around him. The transformation had been gradual and agonizing. First came the loss of speech, then the changes to his body that left him trapped between man and beast. His human mind remained intact, a cruel addition to the curse that ensured he would be fully aware of everything he had lost. The worst part was watching his followers abandon him one by one, their loyalty evaporating as quickly as morning mist once he could no longer speak to command their respect. "They left you alone," Ingrid said, her voice thick with sympathy. "All of them, everyone you had protected and cared for." The bear's confirmation was a sound of such deep grief that Ingrid felt her own heart breaking in response. She understood now why he had watched her so carefully during those first days, why her decision to stay, despite his frightening appearance, had meant so much to him. He had learned that people would only accept him as long as he could give them what they wanted, and once that was no longer possible, they would find reasons to justify their abandonment. But there was more to the story, details that emerged. As Ingrid continued to hold the talk, and the bear continued to share his memories through whatever mystical connection existed between them. The curse was not permanent. It could be broken, but only under very specific circumstances. Someone would have to choose to stay with him, despite knowing his true nature. Someone who understood that freeing him might mean losing him forever. "That's why you've been waiting," Ingrid realized. "Not just for someone to accept you as you are, but for someone willing to risk everything to give you back what was stolen." The bear's eyes filled with something that looked remarkably like tears, and Ingrid felt her own throat tighten with emotion. The depth of his loneliness suddenly made perfect sense, not just the isolation of being trapped in an animal's body, but the terrible knowledge that anyone who might free him would have to care enough about his welfare to potentially sacrifice their own happiness. As winter deepened around the mountain hall, Ingrid found herself sharing more of her own experiences with betrayal and abandonment. She told Aldrich, for now she thought of him by his true name, even in his cursed form, about the neighbors, who had promised to support her through her grief, but gradually grew tired of her need for comfort. She described the relatives who had suggested that her continued mourning was somehow unhealthy, as if love could be scheduled like a harvest or dismissed like unwanted guests. The cruelest part, she admitted during one of their long conversations, by the fire, was realizing that they had loved the idea of me more than they loved me. As long as I was the strong wife who supported her warrior husband and raised successful children, I was worthy of their respect. But the moment I became inconvenient, the moment my grief made them uncomfortable, I became someone they needed to fix or abandon. Aldrich's response was to move closer to where she sat, positioning himself so that she could rest against his warm flank if she chose. The gesture was one of perfect understanding. He knew exactly what it felt like to discover that loyalty was conditional, that even the strongest bonds could be broken when maintaining them required sacrifice or discomfort. "Perhaps," Ingrid said, running her fingers through his thick fur, "we were meant to find each other. Two souls who learned the hard way that true companionship is rarer than gold and more precious than kingdoms." The bear's rumble of agreement seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the hall, and Ingrid felt something settle into place in her chest, a sense of rightness she hadn't experienced since the early days of her marriage to Bjorn. This strange partnership, born of mutual loneliness and deepened by shared understanding, had become something she hadn't dared hope for again. A connection based not on what she could provide or who she used to be, but on the simple recognition of one wounded soul by another. As the snow continued to fall outside and the fire crackled in the great hearth, Ingrid held the silver torque and wondered if she had the courage to face whatever came next, because she was beginning to understand that their story was approaching. A moment of choice, a decision that would determine not just Aldrich's fate, but the direction of whatever life remained to both of them. The tattered battle standard hung from a peg driven deep into the stone wall, positioned where it would catch the first light of dawn through the eastern windows. Ingrid had found it while exploring the upper chambers during a restless morning when sleep had proven elusive, and its discovery had filled her with a mixture of awe and heartbreak that she was still struggling to process. The banner told Aldrich's story more completely than any words could have managed. Woven from silk that had once been royal blue and gold, it bore the image of a great bear rampant beneath a crown of stars, his personal device, she realized, chosen long before his curse gave it such cruel irony. But more telling than the heraldic symbols were the battle scars the standard carried, tears from enemy weapons, burn marks from the fires of war, and stains that spoke of blood spilled in defense of those who could not defend themselves. This was the banner that had flown above Aldrich's forces during his final campaign, the symbol that had rallied his men during the desperate battle against invaders who threatened to overrun his kingdom. According to the fragments of memory she could piece together from their mystical connection, he had been winning that battle when the betrayal struck. His advisor, a man named Thorvald who had served Aldrich's father before him, had chosen the moment of imminent victory to slip poison into the king's wine. The curse had taken hold, just as Aldrich prepared to lead the final charge that would have secured his people's safety. Instead of celebrating triumph, his men had watched in horror as their king collapsed and began the agonizing transformation that stripped away his humanity. Thorvald had stepped forward then, claiming that the gods themselves had judged Aldrich unworthy, and that he would now lead the kingdom in the rightful king's absence. They believed him, Ingrid whispered to the bear, who had followed her to the chamber where the standard hung like a memorial to everything he had lost. Your own men believed that your transformation was divine judgment rather than treachery. Aldrich's response was the low rumble she had learned to recognize as bitter acknowledgement. Of course they had believed it. Who would not choose the comfortable lie that preserved their world over the terrible truth that would have demanded they risk everything to seek justice? Thorvald had been clever in his timing and ruthless in his manipulation of their fears and superstitions, but the standard revealed another layer to the tragedy. one that made Ingrid's heart ache even more deeply for the man trapped within the bear's form. Along the banner's bottom edge, worked in silver thread that caught and held the light, was a phrase in the old tongue, "For love of the realm and all who dwell within it." This had been more than personal ambition or royal duty for Aldrich. His kingship had been an act of love, a commitment to protect and nurture every soul under his care. "That's why the curse is so cruel," she said, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "It didn't just take away your crown or your throne. It took away your ability to protect anyone." The bear's confirmation was a sound of such profound grief that Ingrid felt tears gathering in her own eyes. She had begun to understand the true weight of what she was contemplating. Breaking Aldrich's curse wouldn't just restore his human form. It would return to him the terrible responsibility of leadership, the burden of caring for others that had defined his entire existence. As the days passed and winter tightened its grip on the mountain valley, Ingrid found herself grappling with questions that seemed to have no good answers. She had learned from their mystical connection that the curse could indeed be broken, but the price was steeper than she had initially understood. The person who chose to free Aldrich would take on a burden of their own, not a transformation like his, but something equally difficult to bear. The magic that bound him required a willing sacrifice from someone who understood the full cost of their choice. To break the curse, she would have to accept that Aldrich might choose to leave once he was free, that restoring his humanity might mean losing the companionship that had become so precious to her. Whereas the act of breaking the curse would bind her to this place and this responsibility in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. "I could lose you," she admitted during one of their fireside conversations, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I free you, you'll have choices again. You'll be able to go anywhere, be anything. Why would you stay here with an old woman who has nothing left to offer the world?" Aldrich's response was to move closer, positioning himself so that she could feel the warmth radiating from his massive frame. But she could see the conflict in his intelligent eyes, gratitude for her willingness to consider such a sacrifice warring with his own deep-seated need to protect her from unnecessary pain. The internal struggle became more intense as Ingrid began to examine her own motivations with the brutal honesty that age and loss had taught her. Was she considering breaking the curse because she truly wanted to restore Aldrich's freedom, or because she hoped that freeing him would somehow secure his continued companionship? Was this love, or was it another form of the possessiveness that had driven Thorvald to betray his king rather than risk losing his position of influence? "Bjorn would tell me to stop thinking so much," she said with a rueful smile, remembering her husband's straightforward approach to difficult decisions. "He always said that when you know something is right, you do it regardless of the consequences. But this feels different. This feels like standing at the edge of a cliff with no way to know if there's solid ground or empty air waiting below." The bear moved then, rising from his position by the fire and approaching the chamber where his battle standard hung. When Ingrid followed, she found him standing beneath the tattered silk, his massive head raised to study the symbol of everything he had lost. But there was something different in his posture now, something that spoke not of defeat, but of a king remembering what it meant to rule. When he turned to look at her, Ingrid saw in his eyes a depth of feeling that took her breath away. Not just gratitude for her consideration, not just affection born of shared loneliness, but something deeper and more complex. The kind of love that put the beloved's welfare above one's own desires. The kind of commitment that could weather any storm because it was built on understanding rather than need. "You would stay," she breathed, suddenly certain. "Even if I freed you, even if you had choices again, you would choose to stay here with me." His confirmation was a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, and Ingrid felt something inside her chest, some knot of fear she had carried since discovering the truth about the curse, finally begin to loosen. Standing there beneath his battle standard, surrounded by the weight of history and the promise of an uncertain future, Ingrid began to understand that their choice was not really about breaking curses or restoring lost kingdoms. It was about two people who had learned to love truly, not possessively or conditionally, but with the kind of generosity that makes any sacrifice worthwhile. The cursed iron collar was hidden beneath layers of thick fur at the base of Aldrich's neck, invisible until a moment of perfect trust allowed Ingrid to discover what had been concealed for centuries. She had been checking a wound he had sustained while protecting the hall from another pack of wolves, a deep scratch that had bled more than she liked, when her fingers encountered the cold metal band that encircled his throat like a chain. The collar was ancient and malevolent, forged from black iron and inscribed with runes that seemed to writhe and shift beneath her touch. Unlike the protective symbols carved into the hall's stones or the silver torque that proclaimed his royal heritage, these markings pulsed with a darkness that made her skin crawl. They were the physical manifestation of Thorvald's curse, the magical bonds that held Aldrich trapped between human and animal form. But the discovery of the collar brought with it knowledge that changed everything Ingrid thought she understood about their situation. As her fingers traced the cursed metal, images flooded her mind. Not memories this time, but visions of what breaking the curse would truly require. The magic that bound Aldrich was more complex and cruel than she had imagined, designed not just to punish him, but to ensure that his freedom would always come at a terrible price. The truth was devastating in its simplicity. Removing the collar would indeed restore Aldrich to human form. But the curse's magic required balance. The person who freed him would become the collar's new prisoner, bound to serve as guardian of the hall and all its secrets until someone else proved willing to take their place. It was a cycle of imprisonment disguised as salvation, ensuring that Thorvald's revenge would continue long after his own death. "No," Aldrich rumbled, the sound barely recognizable as coming from a bear's throat. The word was distorted by his animal vocal cords, but unmistakably human in its anguish. "You cannot. I will not allow it." Ingrid's hands stilled on the cursed metal, her heart pounding as she absorbed the implications. She had been prepared to sacrifice her own happiness for Aldrich's freedom, but this was something far worse than loneliness or uncertainty. This was trading one form of imprisonment for another, ensuring that her act of love would trap her in the same magical bonds that had tormented him for centuries. "How long?" she whispered, though part of her dreaded the answer. The visions that answered her question were merciless in their clarity. The hall's previous occupants stretching back through the centuries. Noble souls who had each discovered the truth about the curse and chosen to free their predecessor, only to find themselves bound in turn. Some had lasted decades before someone new arrived to continue the cycle. Others had endured centuries of solitude, watching the world change beyond the mountain valley while they remained frozen in a prison of magical obligation. But there was more to the revelation. Details that made the choice even more agonizing. The curse didn't just bind its victim to the hall, it slowly drained their humanity, year by year, until they became something less than what they had been. Not transformed like Aldrich, but diminished. Their capacity for joy and love and hope gradually eroding, until they existed in a state of hollow endurance. "This is why you tried to discourage me," Ingrid said, understanding flooding through her. "Not because you don't want freedom, but because you know what it would cost me." Aldrich's response was to carefully, gently pull away from her touch, breaking the mystical connection that had allowed her to see the truth. His massive form seemed to shrink in on itself, as if the weight of carrying this knowledge alone for so many years was finally becoming too much to bear. "How many have you watched make this choice?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The bear's answer came not in words, but in the profound weariness that settled over his features. "Too many," his expression seemed to say. Too many good souls who had believed they understood the price they were paying, only to discover that love could be weaponized just as effectively as hate. For the first time since arriving at the hall, Ingrid felt truly lost. The companionship she had found with Aldrich, the sense of purpose that had begun to grow in her heart, the hope that she might build something meaningful from the ruins of her old life. All of it seemed to crumble in the face of this terrible knowledge. How could she choose freedom for him, knowing it would condemn her to the same fate? How could she choose her own welfare, knowing it would leave him trapped forever? "There has to be another way," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she could see in Aldrich's eyes that he had spent centuries searching for alternatives that didn't exist. The curse was elegantly crafted in its cruelty, designed to exploit the very best qualities in its victims. Those who were selfish enough to preserve their own freedom would never consider the sacrifice necessary to break it. Those who were generous enough to consider that sacrifice would be destroyed by their own compassion. It was a trap that fed on love itself, turning the most noble human impulses into instruments of continued suffering. That night, as snow fell steadily outside the tall windows and the fire crackled in the great hearth, Ingrid found herself examining her life with a clarity that was both painful and liberating. She thought of her children, scattered across the world building lives of their own, who would never know what had become of their mother if she made this choice. She thought of Bjorn, whose memory deserved better than to be abandoned in pursuit of a doomed romance with a cursed king. But she also thought of Aldrich, whose nobility had survived centuries of imprisonment, whose capacity for love had remained intact despite betrayal and abandonment. She thought of the protective gentleness with which he had treated her, the careful respect he had shown for her grief and her healing. She thought of the conversations by the fire, the sense of being truly understood for the first time since Bjorn's death. "Tell me about the others," she said finally, settling beside him near the warmth of the flames. "The ones who chose to free their predecessors. Tell me about their lives here." Aldrich's reluctance was obvious, but gradually he began to share what he had witnessed during his long imprisonment. Some had found peace in their sacrifice, creating meaning from their solitude by tending the hall and preserving its history. Others had raged against their fate, becoming bitter and twisted by resentment. A few had tried to warn away potential rescuers, while others had actively sought to perpetuate the cycle in hope of ending their own suffering. But all of them, Aldrich made clear, had eventually succumbed to the curse's erosion of their humanity. Love, joy, hope, even anger, all of it gradually faded until they existed in a state of numb endurance, waiting for death to claim what the curse had left behind. And yet, Ingrid said slowly, they all made the choice knowing what it would cost them. That suggests something about the kind of people who end up here, doesn't it? Something about what we're willing to sacrifice for those we love. Aldrich's response was a sound of such profound grief that Ingrid felt her own heart breaking in sympathy. He understood exactly what she was suggesting, and the knowledge was agony for him. Every person who had freed their predecessor had been someone like Ingrid, someone capable of love deep enough to risk everything, someone whose very goodness made them vulnerable to the curse's cruel logic. As the night deepened and the snow continued to fall, Ingrid found herself facing the most difficult decision of her life. Not just whether to break Aldrich's curse, but how to live with herself regardless of what she chose. Because she was beginning to understand that some choices changed you just by being contemplated, and that the woman who had arrived at this hall seeking solitude was already gone forever. Ingrid's marriage ring caught the firelight as she turned it slowly around her finger, a habit she had maintained for 37 years of marriage and 7 months of widowhood. The simple band of silver, worn thin by decades of daily wear, had been Bjorn's first gift to her, crafted by his own hands from metal he had earned in his earliest battles. It was more than jewelry. It was a symbol of promises kept, of love that had endured through joy and sorrow, of a partnership that had shaped every choice she had made since accepting it. Now, as she sat before the great hearth, with Aldrich resting near her feet, she found herself confronting what the ring represented in light of the impossible decision she faced. Was removing it an act of betrayal, or was keeping it a chain that bound her to the past when life demanded she embrace an uncertain future? "He would want me to be happy," she said softly, speaking as much to herself as to her companion. Bjorn always said that love shouldn't be a cage, that the point of caring for someone was to help them become their truest self. But I don't know if what I'm contemplating is love or madness. Aldrich raised his massive head to study her face in the flickering light. In his intelligent eyes, she saw understanding and gratitude, but also a deep sadness that spoke to his own internal conflict. He wanted freedom desperately. She could see it in every line of his powerful form, but he also wanted to protect her from the suffering that freeing him would bring. The past 3 days had been filled with sleepless nights and endless contemplation, as Ingrid wrestled with the choice before her. She had walked every inch of the hall, examining the tapestries and carvings that told stories of noble sacrifice and heroic deeds. She had studied the runes carved into the hearthstones, symbols that spoke of protection and loyalty and the prices such virtues sometimes demanded. She had even climbed to the highest chamber of the hall, where tall windows provided a view of the mountain paths that led back to the world she had left behind. From that vantage point, she could see the smoke rising from distant chimneys, evidence of lives being lived in warm homes filled with family and purpose. Her own children were out there somewhere, Magnus leading his soldiers, Astrid raising her family, Eric seeking adventure in unknown lands. They would continue their lives, whether she stayed in this hall or returned to the village, whether she broke Aldrich's curse or left it intact. Her choice would ripple through their lives, but it would not define them. That realization had been both liberating and terrifying. For so long, her identity had been wrapped up in being needed, as a wife, as a mother, as a member of a community that valued her skills and contributions. The thought that she could make a choice based purely on what felt right to her, rather than what others might expect or approve of, was foreign enough to make her dizzy. But there was another dimension to her contemplation, one that touched the deepest parts of her heart. In the weeks since discovering Aldrich's true nature, she had felt herself changing in ways that went far beyond simple companionship or even love. His presence had awakened parts of herself that she had thought died with Bjorn, her capacity for wonder, her willingness to take risks, her belief that extraordinary things were still possible in a world that often seemed determined to grind such hopes into dust. "I think," she said, continuing to turn the ring around her finger, "that I've been confusing grief with loyalty. I thought that moving forward meant leaving Bjorn behind, but maybe it means taking the best of what he gave me and using it to build something new." The bear made a soft sound that might have been agreement, but Ingrid could see the tension in his powerful frame. He was fighting his own battle between hope and despair, between the desperate desire for freedom and the equally desperate need to protect her from harm. It was a conflict that did him credit, but also broke her heart, because she could see how it was tearing him apart. On the morning of the 4th day, Ingrid made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She climbed to the upper chamber she had been using as a study and took out the writing materials she had brought from her old life. The letters she wrote that morning were the most difficult she had ever composed, but also the most honest. To Magnus, she wrote of pride in the man he had become and confidence in his ability to lead others with wisdom and strength. She told him that his father's best qualities lived on in him, and that she had no worries about his future or the future of those under his protection. To Astrid, she wrote of the joy she had found in watching her daughter build a loving family, and of the certainty that her grandchildren would grow up knowing the difference between right and wrong, because of the example their mother set for them. She described the happiness it brought her to know that the traditions of their family would continue in such capable hands. To Eric, she wrote of adventure and the courage to follow one's heart even when the destination was uncertain. She told him that his willingness to seek new horizons was a gift that would serve him well, and that she hoped he would find in distant lands the sense of purpose and belonging that every soul deserved. But to all three children, she wrote the same essential message, that love was not diminished by distance or changed circumstances, that the bonds between them were strong enough to survive any challenge, and that her greatest achievement as a mother had been raising them to be independent enough to thrive without her constant presence in their lives. The letters were not farewells exactly, but they were preparations. Whatever choice she made regarding Aldrich's curse, her children deserved to know that she was proud of them, that she trusted them to build good lives, and that her love for them was unconditional and eternal. As evening approached, Ingrid found herself drawn to the chamber where Eldric's battle standard hung like a memorial to everything he had lost. She stood before the tattered silk for a long time, studying the image of the bear rampant beneath its crown of stars. There was something both tragic and hopeful about that heraldic device, a reminder that even in his cursed form, Eldric retained the noble qualities that had made him a king worth following. "I've made my decision," she said when she heard his footsteps behind her. "But I want to ask you something first, and I need you to answer as honestly as you can." Aldrich moved to stand beside her beneath his banner, his massive presence somehow both comforting and heartbreaking. When she turned to face him, she saw in his eyes the depth of feeling that had made this choice inevitable from the moment she first understood his true nature. "If our situations were reversed," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning in her chest, "if I were the one trapped and you were the one who could free me, what would you choose?" The bear's response was immediate and unequivocal. He moved closer, pressing his great head against her shoulder in a gesture that spoke of protection and devotion, and the kind of love that put the beloved's welfare above one's own survival. She felt the tremor that ran through his powerful frame, the conflict between his desire for freedom and his need to shield her from harm. But beneath that conflict, she sensed something else, a recognition that some bonds were strong enough to transcend curses and imprisonment, that some forms of love created their own kind of freedom, even in the most constrained circumstances. "That's what I thought," she said, running her fingers through his thick fur. "That's exactly what I thought you would say." As night fell over the mountain hall and snow began to fall once again outside the tall windows, Ingrid moved to the chest where she kept her most precious possessions. From among the few items she had brought from her old life, she withdrew Bjorn's war axe and held it in hands that no longer trembled with uncertainty. The weapon felt right in her grip, balanced and purposeful in a way that reminded her of the woman she had been before grief stripped away her confidence. But more than that, it felt like a bridge between who she had been and who she was becoming, a reminder that strength could take many forms, and that sometimes the greatest courage was found not in battles against external enemies, but in the willingness to risk everything for something that mattered more than safety. "Tomorrow night," she said, her voice carrying the certainty that had finally settled in her heart. "When the moon is full and the conditions are right, I'm going to break your curse, Aldrich. Not because I'm sure about what comes after, but because I'm sure about what's right." The bear's response was a sound that seemed to contain everything he couldn't say in words, gratitude and love and fear and hope all tangled together in a rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. When she knelt beside him and removed her marriage ring, setting it carefully on the stone floor between them, his understanding was immediate and profound. The ring caught the firelight one last time as she looked down at it, this symbol of a love that had defined her past and would always be part of her story. But tomorrow would be about a different kind of love, one that looked forward instead of backward, one that created new possibilities instead of preserving old patterns. Whatever price she would pay for breaking Aldrich's curse, she was finally ready to meet it with her eyes open and her heart at peace. The moment the final mirror shard shattered beneath Bjorn's war axe, the cursed iron collar around Aldrich's neck began to glow with heat that turned metal white-hot against his fur. But instead of causing him pain, the burning seemed to cleanse rather than destroy, each pulse of light stripping away another layer of the dark. Magic that had bound him for centuries, Ingrid felt the curse's retaliation immediately, a cold that started in her chest and spread outward like ice, forming in her veins. This was the price she had agreed to pay, the burden that would take Aldrich's place once he was free. But as the magical bonds settled around her spirit, she discovered something that Thorvald's malice had never anticipated. The curse could only claim someone who was alone and isolated, and Ingrid was neither. The transformation that overtook Aldrich was both beautiful and terrible to witness. His massive bare form began to shimmer and shift, fur receding to reveal pale skin beneath, limbs reshaping themselves into human proportions. The process looked agonizing, and Ingrid heard sounds of pain that made her heart clench with sympathy. But she could also see the wonder in his eyes as he felt his humanity returning after centuries of imprisonment. As the bear's form dissolved away, the man who emerged was exactly what Ingrid had imagined during their mystical connections. Tall and broad-shouldered, with kind eyes and strong hands, Aldrich possessed the bearing of someone born to lead others with wisdom and compassion. But it was his expression that made her breath catch, the look of someone seeing the world with human eyes for the first time in longer than most people lived. The cursed collar, its purpose fulfilled, cracked and fell away from his neck like shed skin. In its place appeared something that made Ingrid gasp with wonder, a crown of pure gold that materialized from light itself, settling onto Aldrich's brow with a weight that spoke of divine approval rather than magical compulsion. This was no simple restoration of his original wooden crown, but something far more significant. The golden circlet was unmarked by time or tarnish, its surface bearing new runes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. These were symbols of renewal and redemption, of love triumphant over malice, of hope proved stronger than despair. But even as she marveled at the crown's appearance, Ingrid felt the curse's cold grip tightening around her own spirit. The magical bonds that had held Aldrich were seeking to claim her in his place, to continue the cycle of imprisonment that had sustained Thorvald's revenge for so long. She gritted her teeth against the sensation, determined not to let her own suffering diminish the miracle of Aldrich's freedom. "Ingrid," he said, and his voice was everything she had imagined it would be, deep and warm, carrying the authority of kingship, but touched with gentleness that spoke to his true nature. "What have you done?" Before she could answer, before the curse could fully claim her, something extraordinary happened. The golden crown on Aldrich's brow began to pulse with increasing intensity, its light spreading outward until it filled the entire hall. Where that light touched the dark magic attempting to bind Ingrid, the cursed energy simply dissolved like shadows fleeing the dawn. "No," Aldrich said, his voice carrying the command of someone who had ruled wisely and well. "I will not be free at such a price. I reject any liberation that requires another suffering." The crown's light intensified, and Ingrid felt the curse's grip on her spirit beginning to weaken. But more than that, she felt something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the choice Aldrich was making. He was using his newly restored power not to secure his own freedom, but to protect her from the consequences of freeing him. "The curse demanded balance," he continued, extending his hand toward her as the golden light continued to drive back the darkness. "But there are different kinds of balance than the one Thorvald envisioned. Love balanced against hate, hope balanced against despair. The willing sacrifice of two hearts united, balanced against the malice of one bitter soul." As their hands touched, Ingrid felt the last of the curse's cold grip release her spirit. But instead of leaving her unchanged, the experience had transformed her in ways that had nothing to do with magical compulsion. She felt stronger, more certain of her own worth and purpose than she had since Bjorn's death. The woman who had arrived at this hall seeking solitude was gone forever. replaced by someone who had learned to choose love over safety and found herself transformed by that choice. The hall itself was changing around them, the stones brightening as if centuries of accumulated shadow were finally lifting. Tapestries that had been faded and worn restored themselves to their original glory, and the great hearth began to burn with a warmth that had nothing to do with the logs she had placed there. But most wonderful of all was the expression on Aldrich's face as he looked at her, not gratitude or obligation, but love freely given and joyfully received. The crown on his brow marked him as a king restored, but the look in his eyes marked him as a man who had found something more precious than any kingdom. "We are both free," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "Free to choose our own path forward, together or apart as we decide." Looking into his eyes, feeling the strength of their joined hands, Ingrid knew exactly what path she wanted to choose. Spring arrived early in the mountain valley, as if the breaking of the ancient curse had awakened the land itself from a long winter's sleep. Ingrid stood in the great hall's eastern window, watching Aldrich work in the garden they had planted. Together, his movements sure and purposeful, as he tended the growing things that would feed them through the coming year. The new loom he had built for her occupied the place of honor near the tall windows, positioned to catch the best light for her work. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship that surpassed even the one Bjorn had made for her so many years ago, carved from mountain oak and inlaid with symbols that spoke of partnership and shared purpose. But more than its obvious beauty, what made this loom precious was what it represented. Not just Aldrich's skill with his hands, but his understanding of who she was and what brought meaning to her life. The first piece she had woven on this new loom hung nearby, a tapestry that told their story in thread and color. It depicted a woman and a bear before a great hearth, then showed the woman holding a crown, while the bear transformed into a king, and finally portrayed two people working side by side to rebuild something beautiful from ruins. The work had taken her months to complete, but every hour spent at the loom had felt like a gift rather than labor. Her children had returned for the summer, drawn by letters that spoke of their mother's happiness and curiosity about the man she had chosen to share her life. Magnus had arrived first, his warrior's bearing softening when he saw the contentment in Ingrid's face and the respect with which Aldrich treated her. The two men had spent long hours talking about leadership and the responsibilities that came with protecting others, forming a bond that had surprised Ingrid with its depth. Astrid had brought her family for a month-long visit, her children delighting in the mountain hall's vast spaces and the stories Aldrich told of ancient times. Watching her daughter's approval as she observed the partnership between her mother and this kind, strong man had filled Ingrid with a satisfaction she hadn't expected to feel again. Even Eric had made the journey from his new home in the western settlements, bringing tales of exploration and discovery that had captivated Aldrich's imagination. The two had planned expeditions into the surrounding peaks, adventures that would have been impossible when Aldrich was trapped in bear form, but now opened up new possibilities for both of them. "They approve," Aldrich had said after Eric's departure, his arm around Ingrid's waist as they stood together in the hall that had become their shared home. "Your children see that you are happy, and that is enough for them." But it was more than approval, Ingrid knew. Her children had seen that she had found someone who valued her, not for what she could provide or who she had been, but for who she was choosing to become. The woman who had raised them with such strength and wisdom was still there, but she was also something new, someone who had learned to love again without diminishing the love she had known before. The village in the valley below had gradually accepted the truth about the lifted curse and the restored king who now lived in their midst. Aldrich's gentle leadership had helped them through a harsh winter, and his knowledge of ancient farming techniques had improved their harvests. More importantly, his example of choosing love over revenge had begun to heal old wounds and grudges that had divided the community for generations. They had married in a simple ceremony at the hall, with Ingrid's children and representatives from the village as witnesses. The priest who performed the service was an old man who claimed to remember stories his grandfather had told about King Eldric's reign, and he had wept openly as he blessed their union. There had been no grand celebration, no royal proclamation, just two people promising to support each other through whatever joys and sorrows lay ahead. Now, as Ingrid watched her husband tend their garden in the morning light, she felt a peace that went deeper than contentment. This was not the life she had planned when she first arrived at the mountain hall with her 5 silver coins and her burden of grief. But it was a life she had chosen with her eyes open, built on understanding rather than need, strengthened by shared hardship rather than weakened by it. The loom called to her as it did every morning, its smooth wood warm beneath her hands as she settled into the rhythm of creation. Today she would begin a new piece, a blanket for the first grandchild Astrid was expecting, woven with all the love and hope a grandmother could pour into thread and pattern. It would be work that connected past to future, honoring the traditions she had learned from her own mother while creating something entirely new. Through the window, she could see Aldrich pausing in his work to look back at the hall, his face lighting with the smile she had grown to treasure above all else. When their eyes met across the distance, she felt the same flutter of recognition that had marked their first moment of true understanding, the knowledge that she was seen and valued for exactly who she was. The golden crown he wore caught the morning light, but it was not the symbol of his restored kingship that made him precious to her. It was the calluses on his hands from honest work, the gentleness with which he tended wounded creatures they found on the mountain, the way he listened to her stories as if each one was a gift beyond price. As her shuttle moved through the looms, threads creating patterns that would warm someone she had yet to meet, Ingrid smiled at the perfect rightness of this moment. She had come to the mountain seeking an ending, a place to rest after a life fully lived. Instead, she had found a beginning, not just for herself, but for love itself, proving that some bonds are strong enough to break any curse, and some choices create their own kind of magic. Outside, spring continued its ancient work of renewal, and inside the mountain hall, 2 hearts that had learned to trust again wove their lives together with the patience and skill of master craftspeople, creating something beautiful that would endure long after winter returned to the peaks.